Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show. Join us on the journey to financial success. Let's go. Today I was basically reminded about something, and I immediately thought I'd take the recorder and record this episode for you, because I saw an article where I would normally on first glance say this is not really relevant for us, but on second glance I thought, yeah, it could be if it's tweaked a little bit. So the article was on Bloomberg talking about the issue that a lot of owners of commercial real estate, especially office buildings, have. Because as you know, a lot of jobs have basically moved to work from home or work virtually, or companies have automated and reduced their workforce and so forth. So end result is that less and less office space is needed, and there are places where they used to have these huge office towers, and they're only like 40 or 50% occupied. The article was mainly talking about what can an owner of that kind of a building do to basically get it full again and attract companies to basically rent their building. And one of the initiatives that was suggested there that seems to be taking hold was the fact that a lot of companies want to be able to state and prove that they utilize anything and everything that improves sustainability. Now, how does this apply for our residential real estate investing? Well, in a way, the same. You know that the main strategy that we're using is working with turnkey providers who find the ugly duckling in a good neighborhood. They renovate it, put it on the market for a fair price. We buy it from them, and then they manage it for us, which also ultimately allows us to keep our amount of time that we need to manage our portfolio relatively low. But what they typically do is trying to find a balance that brings the property, this ugly duckling, back into the modern world and up to modern code and modern fixings for bathrooms and kitchens and stuff like that. But the prevailing thinking still is that when you do much above and beyond, you can, in a way, over-renovate a property and then have a hard time getting tenants who are willing to pay a higher rent. If you think about it, if you do really, really expensive faucets, really, really expensive appliances, granite countertops and stuff like that all over the place, yes, absolutely is it nice to have that if you are the tenant. But what you really, if you had a property that next door doesn't have all these little extra luxuries, rents for, let's say, $1,500 a month, would you pay $1,800 or $1,900 a month because the house is nicer? Most people probably wouldn't, especially in these times where money is relatively tight. If the difference were $100, maybe. But to make these high-end improvements, you have to spend considerably more money, and so the rent would have to be higher. That's why a lot of people that do renovations and flips and stuff like that don't want to spend the money. Now, how does this relate to the office building stuff? The sustainability aspect is one of the few things I would always say people with a conscience are actually willing to pay more. And here is how this works and why they would be willing to pay more. If you think about it, the sustainability aspects include things like better insulation for the house, which means in the wintertime, you need much less energy, whether it's oil or gas or whatever other energy, pellet oven or things that you might use to heat the house. Another thing that you can do is putting solar panels and battery systems into the house. So the solar energy collected during the day and stored overnight in the battery to run all the electricity needs of the house, the solar, after the installation is made, is basically free. Then the third thing could be to say, from a sustainability perspective, we lay out the roof and the gutter system and all these things from day one so that any kind of rainwater gets collected and there's a little pump so the collected water can be used for all the landscaping around the house. So what do you end up having from the tenant's perspective? You have a house that basically costs you nothing to heat, because the heating is basically minimal when you have good insulation. And the little bit of heating, you might as well use electricity to heat rather than oil or gas or anything like that, because guess what? The electricity comes free from the sun and is stored in your battery. So no electricity cost either. And if a tenant, which is more and more likely in the future, ends up having an electric vehicle, they can charge from the battery, but also because these vehicles typically have very massive batteries in them, they will also be able to supply the house with electricity in an emergency case where the power grid doesn't provide electricity. Here you have a house now with basically no heating cost, no electricity cost, and very little water cost to maintain landscaping because it comes from collected water from the rain. Can you easily quantify how much money this means per month? Not really, but let's just say we have an average house and we could save about $300 a month because we have no heating, no electricity costs, no watering costs. If you say I have one house for $1,500 and the other house is $1,900, but $300 of the $400 difference is basically returned because there are almost no utility charges, which in almost all cases the tenant pays, then you have this modern, very sustainable house and only pay $100 more than a tenant who rents the other house and has to pay for all the utilities on top of the rent. So that's something to consider, and this is the similarity when office building owners say, okay, we want to improve our properties to be more sustainable because that attracts companies who make sustainability an important part of their business, while we as investors can do the same by finding turnkey providers and flippers and renovators who take these sustainability aspects into account so we have a higher value property that we can rent for a reasonably slightly higher price than comparable properties without these improvements. And guess what? These improvements like solar panels, better insulation, rainwater collection, those are all capital expenditures that you can maintain and that you can actually get your tax benefits for as well. Because one thing is clear, the renovation is more expensive if you do it that way, but the tenant is better off. The tenant can be consciously about the environment, and you have a higher value house for the long term. So that's something to consider. Are they easy to find? No, not yet, because it's not in very many people's mind. But I think it will come more and more that we realize we have now all the technology in place to basically generate our electricity and our needs and collect our water. It's nothing new that needs to be invented. We just need to implement it. And the more it's being implemented, the cheaper it's going to get. So I think there's a bright future there for more sustainable building, similar to what has started in the commercial space already. So I hope this was informative for you, and I want you to consider when you see a house that has some of these systems to really not forget that the savings in utility are actually similar to a tenant who otherwise would have to pay the rent plus the utilities. Right? You always want to keep the whole picture in mind. So I hope this was helpful. Be well and stay safe, and I talk to you tomorrow.